Hello and welcome back to the Walking Dead Retrospective, where today we are finally delving into the much anticipated Negan Saga. So buckle up, because we are about to enter a whole new world of comic versus TV changes. But let's not waste any more time and jump right in. Last time we left off with the group having their first ever Negan encounter on their way back from Hilltop, and so we'll pick up with their arrival back at Alexandria. The most notable things here is 1. Maggie telling Glenn that she is pregnant, which happened quite a bit earlier in the TV version, and 2. The conversation between Rick and Andrea. Here we essentially get more of what we've seen already. There's obviously a strong bond between them, and after seeing the Hilltop, Rick finally stops pushing Andrea away. To which she responds by roasting him a little for being a wuss at first, but then saying that for the first time in a long time, she actually looks forward to the future. Like we talked about last time, while I've never understood people who say that the Michonne-Rick relationship feels unnatural, I do agree with the sentiment that the time skip right after No Way Out, which would have contained these sorts of scenes of Rick opening back up after losing Jesse, does feel a little more whiplashy than it did in the books. In the TV version, on the other hand, once the group arrives back at Alexandria, it's all hands on deck on how to deal with the Saviors. A similar recruitment scene also takes place in the book, but it's quite a bit more expanded in the show. Mostly because an explicit attack is being planned rather than cautionary measures as they were in the book. Though arguably the biggest differences are the character reactions regarding this whole thing. First off, we see Morgan openly push back on Rick's decisions, which, considering his character, does make perfect sense and is a part of the show that I actually think had the right idea when it comes to the Negan Saga. Emphasis on the idea, because the way it was executed didn't really hit the mark. But hold that thought. When it comes to these events in the book, it's a fairly straightforward storyline of Rick trying to get more recruits, no one really wanting to fight, and then they get forced to fight as Negan himself makes an appearance. Whereas in the show, I think seeing people actually push back on Rick's decisions to seek out enemies at all is an interesting dimension considering everything they've been through already. From their perspective, they are safe right now. Sure, they're low on supplies, but purposefully finding an enemy might be something they just don't want to do. Again, the execution of it fell flat, but I think the idea of a more morally complex story was pretty good. Though the other major change here is the presence of Tara, who implicitly plays a pretty major role here. As we see Rick deliver his speech, he makes their intention pretty clear.
We kill them all.
And because Tara has heard those particular words somewhere else already,
Kill them all.
obviously she is a little shook by Rick in this case. Though just keep that in mind for now. Following this, we get right to planning the attack itself, and again, absolutely all of this is exclusive to the show. But long story short, the plan is to hit them in the middle of the night while most of them are asleep. And it's here where Rick's murder jacket is back with a vengeance, as we get one of the darkest episodes in the entire show. Because no matter how you swing it, this scorched earth strategy is absolutely brutal. And to give you a better sense of how monumental this attack really was, this was the first ever episode where Glenn, Heath, Gabriel, and Tara kill a living person. With how cold Rick is about these sorts of things, you might forget that in the grand scheme of things, we have many characters who still largely have their hands clean. And so that scene of Glenn struggling with what he's about to do is absolutely gut-wrenching. And that's even with him seeing the photos of Negan's victims. It's simply not in his nature. Oh, and a couple of things about the photos. Number 1, they're obviously foreshadowing his own fate. So you can probably imagine with people familiar with the book we're thinking right now. But number 2, there's an Easter egg if you're looking closely. Because one of the bodies looks awfully similar to Big Tiny, despite him obviously being killed by Thomas way back in Season 3. I can't seem to find a confirmation for this, but I remember people talking about it when the episode originally aired. So take this with a grain of salt, maybe it is just us reading into it a little too much. Though returning to the story, I know that the Rick-Negan conflict has sparked countless debates over the years of who is in the right and who is in the wrong in certain situations, but when it comes to the lineup, I am sorry, Negan absolutely went easy on the group after what happened here. To give you a sense of scale, in the books, so far, Rick's gang has killed that group of bikers, so that's like 3 or 4. And they'd get a couple more in a raid that we'll talk about in a second. So, even optimistically, that's like 10 saviors. In the show, on the other hand, and big shout out to Shinokiba on Reddit for compiling this, by the way, as of now, Rick's gang has already killed 34 saviors, which would increase to 56 by the time Negan himself appears. Do you see how there's already a massive discrepancy between everything we're seeing? Purely numbers-wise, 56 people is absolutely crazy. I mean, that's like the entirety of Alexandria. But Rick's group gets off with losing, what, 2? And don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying Negan's a good guy, or even redeemable for that matter. He never has been, and he never will be. I'm just trying to paint a picture of how different even his introduction is. In the story sense, Rick and the gang have already crossed a point of no return, that much is certain. But in a meta sense, like we talked about last time, I think this completely threw off any sense of realism when it comes to this upcoming conflict, because the scale is way off. Sure, the saviors are a large group, but the fact that even these 50 plus people didn't even make a dent really turned the rest of the Negan Saga into, for lack of a better word, a cheap action flick. I still remember all those threads of people genuinely asking, how many people do the saviors have? Because yes, their numbers were ridiculous, and not in the good sense. In the comic, sure, their numbers were big, but nowhere near the level of the show. Instead, what made them scary was how ruthless and well-armed they were. When it comes to the show, however, for some reason, the writers just inflated their numbers to the point that absolutely all encounters were meaningless. Because hey, there are always more, right? We'll be talking plenty more about this later, so for now, just hold that thought, I guess. The last thing in this episode is us finding out that Maggie and Carol had been captured by yet another subgroup of saviors. And surprise, surprise, all of this is 100% exclusive to the show, and I'd go as far as to say that almost all of it was pure filler. Obviously, it does continue setting up Carol's next arc, but in retrospect, considering all of these saviors just die anyway, the amount of fluff in this episode is very obvious. The only things I want to mention here is 1, they absolutely nailed the tone of the episode, and Carol torching them is still a, albeit incredibly dark, but an awesome moment. And number 2, something that I've already touched on before, in the show, the whole "we are Negan" thing is played up a ton more and is actually an aspect of the story I would have loved to see expanded on. What you have to remember is that in the story, no one has ever seen Negan. So this actually serves a strategic purpose. I think there would have been a lot of great story potential there as the group are seemingly going mad as they run into Negan after Negan. Considering how arcadey the savior seemed already, I think it would have at least added a new dimension to that endless number. Obviously it wouldn't have any meaning for the comic book readers, but for the TV audience, I think it would have made the actual Negan meeting even more intense. Especially if you played off Simon, as Negan initially. But anyway, returning to the book for a bit, because not even a day has passed since their first run-in with the Saviors, things appear to be mostly chill for now. Though with that said, some preparations are still being done. Most notably, Eugene's plan of manufacturing bullets. The thing in the books is that unlike in the adaptation where Eugene and Abe already sort of made up in Season 5, they are still on rocky ground, especially because of the whole Rosita thing. So this also functions as a sort of a reconnection between the two. And you may now be wondering, why did I suddenly switch to the book if this also happens in the show? Well, you see, there's this minor thing that happens in the book here. We see the two walking and just talking about life, everything they've been through, etc. And just when Abraham opens up telling Eugene that he just wants Rosita to be happy, Out of nowhere, a bolt appears straight through his head. And as he collapses, we cut to Dwight telling Eugene to stay still. Though before we carry on with the book, you'll have to indulge me in some turbo nerding because words cannot begin to describe how perfect these episodes were on initial viewing. The amount of uneasiness I felt watching the book literally be adapted one for one and expecting that bolt to appear at any moment, but it never did. And the Abe-Eugene dynamic in this episode is just a chef's kiss. Seeing them just scream at each other about the walker was way more entertaining than it probably ever intended to be, but I can't help but have a big stupid smile whenever these two talk. But yeah, in terms of sheer excitement, I don't think the TV version has ever lived up to this bit of late season 6. And it's not just because of knowing Negan's right around the corner, but also because of all the remixes we've seen already. The whole satellite sequence, for example, was a major departure. So at this point, no one knew what the writers had cooked up. So yeah, I think the Abe switch up was so perfectly executed and deliberately baiting the comic book readers into that uneasiness, it was just so much fun to watch. Though we still have to talk about the TV version of these events, right? Well, those are equally thrilling because again, it was absolutely anxiety-inducing. We see Daryl, Denise, and Rosita go out on a supply run, and while the entire episode was pretty exciting, what I want to talk about the most is Denise. Because I think what they did with her character was actually super smart. Obviously, she's not a super major character, right? But she has been there for quite some time, and giving her this little mini arc can make her death hit pretty hard. And in a meta sense, even knowing the book, I think they still absolutely nailed the surprise moment of Dwight's bolt appearing as she is suddenly cut off mid-speech. Though importantly, in the show, there's the added dimension of Daryl already having personal beef with Dwight, and considering all the parallels between their characters we've already discussed, this just added fuel to the fire to all the Daryl replacing Dwight theories that were floating around at the time. Because it was pretty clear that Dwight is being set up as a sort of a mirror villain for Daryl. Oh, and note how this time around, Dwight's face already has his signature scar, leaving a very narrow window of time where he could have gotten it. So putting 2 and 2 together, you can already conclude that Negan's punishments for trying to flee the group are pretty severe and that he rules with an iron fist. Especially considering that even after that, Dwight is right back under Negan's control. Though it's also here where another iconic moment happens, as we see that Eugene had been captured by Dwight's group, only for him to employ some very illegal techniques as he chows down on Dwight. This is adapted from the book, but I think it's no surprise that this was memed into absolute oblivion when it was adapted. Though speaking of the books, let's get back to those. After Abe's death, Dwight begins to explain that this isn't how they usually begin business negotiations, saying that they really should have expected to be tracked down after they shot down a bunch of their people. And again, note how one of Negan's main lieutenants are sent after the group as soon as their initial confrontations went sideways. While in the show, it took 40 people to prompt a response? But before we follow up with them, we cut back to Alexandria, where we get a pretty comedic scene we talked about last time, as Carl stumbles into Rick's bedroom, only to see Rick and Andrea together. But before they can talk the whole thing out, gunshots ring out in the distance as we cut to Dwight telling Alexandria to wake up. Rick and him do exchange a few words, but just like in the show, Eugene chows down, at which point the Alexandrians open fire on Dwight's gang and they ultimately flee. Obviously, the major difference here is that Dwight doesn't attack them at just a random location, but rather right at Alexandria's gates. And this prompts Rick and Andrea to immediately go after them. Though despite their best efforts, they get overwhelmed by walkers, and the only thing they can manage to do is grab Abe's corpse before he is devoured. And I can't stress enough how much different this whole thing feels in the book. Because in the show, I mean, come on, they just carried out an explicit attack on the Saviors, right? obviously there will be a retaliation. In the book, on the other hand, Dwight appears out of the blue in literally the next issue after Rick's first encounter with the Saviors. So, unlike the show, where the battles are already going back and forth as soon as the mid-season finale, this attack was a massive shock more than anything else. The community is shook to its very core, not just because they just lost Abraham, but rather because they were attacked by someone who they literally have next to zero information about. So it's not even a, what are we going to do now? But rather, what can we even do? Though with that, we once again find ourselves holding a funeral for Abraham and Denise in the show. And once again, the tone in these episodes is simply perfect. Even tiny things like that one scene of Morgan just looking at where Carol used to sit, and then turn around to see people prepping guns is just so ominous and absolutely nails the vibe of going into Negan's arrival. Though when it comes to the book, we get a few more scenes regarding the immediate state of things, notably everyone in the community now doubting their security. Again, in the show, they've already carried out an attack on the Saviors, so none of this really comes as a surprise, and they're much more consciously preparing for what might come next. But yeah, in the books, Glenn confirms that he wishes to move to Hilltop because of Maggie's pregnancy, and people are generally not so sure about the state of things. And okay, before I say anything else, if I've been nerding out over music in the show so far, then this time I ask you to literally stop everything you're doing and listen to this part. Because the series finally used a Johnny Cash song. I'll be the first to admit that I am more than a little biased here, but any episode that begins with Johnny Cash, bout to be a banger. But there's another reason why I bring up Johnny Cash specifically. Because if you've been following the behind the scenes of the show, you will have heard Andrew Lincoln's wish for his exit. He said that once Rick dies, he wants Hurt by Johnny Cash to play in the credits. And considering Hurt is my favorite song of Johnny Cash, obviously I was a little sad that it never came to fruition. But hey, Rick's not dead, right? So who knows, it might still happen. Anyway, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Oh, and a quick detail, the foreshadowing of Carl looking at one of the Savior's guns with Lucille inscribed on the handle is a nice little detail. In story though, after all the deaths she's seen and with another big bad looming, Carol just can't take it anymore and decides to leave Alexandria, prompting Rick and Morgan to go after her. I think I've made it pretty clear by now that I think Morgan was severely underutilized in Season 6, so I won't repeat all that here, but seeing his and Rick's dynamic is always a ton of fun, so I think this was a pretty good addition to the show. In the meantime, following Denise's death, Daryl's hatred for Dwight grows, and he goes after him while Michonne, Glenn, and Rosita follow him. I am honestly of two minds when it comes to this portion of the story, because on one hand, it was absolutely awesome to see the early Negan story expanded on with additional drama from within Alexandria. Because in the books, it was surprise after surprise after surprise with absolutely no room to breathe. And because adapting it wouldn't have had the same feel for the comic book readers, I think the writers intentionally tried switching up the story to still maintain that feeling of having no idea what comes next for absolutely everyone, including those familiar with the source material. And because of that, yes, I was at the edge of my seat for each and every episode. But on the flip side, as much as the anticipation is there in the show, it really lacked that shock value that came from the absolutely breakneck pace in the comic book. As I said, we go from meeting the Saviors for the first time ever in issue 97 to Negan himself appearing in issue 100. And I think that aspect of it just being one thing after another isn't nearly as pronounced in the show. And just before we move on, I do have a fun little fact for you. Initially, the penultimate episode was titled The Calm Before, obviously foreshadowing the events of the finale, but it was changed to East before the episode aired. Though I think you'll agree that The Calm Before does describe this episode perfectly. And yes, the naming scheme would later be used in the Whisperer arc, though again, let's not rush ahead. Though returning to the book for a bit, Here we get another scene between Rick and Andrea where they essentially just talk about her moving in with Rick since she spends most of her time here anyway. Though they also share some words regarding Abraham, where Rick says that he feels like he's already forgetting him, neatly establishing the tone of everything to follow, because yes, once Negan comes into the picture, there really won't be any time to grieve. But importantly, Rick says that after Dwight's sudden attack, he wants to return to the Hilltop to get a better idea of what they're going up against, but telling Andrea that he needs her to stay behind and protect Alexandria in case they return. So with that, they pack up the RV and get ready to go. In the adaptation, on the other hand, there are a lot more things going on all at once. First off, Daryl's group is captured by the Saviors, so they're still somewhere out there. Secondly, it's not just a case of Rick wanting more information, but rather a necessity for a doctor since Maggie suddenly falls ill and obviously everyone's worried about the baby. And thirdly, because Morgan and Carol are also still somewhere out there. Though before they depart, I once again want to nerd out for a little bit, because the tone of these two final episodes is again absolutely perfect. Everything from the color grading to the fall setting in to the very slightly somber music, it was all genuinely excellent. And then you have that conversation between Rick and Abraham, and man, does that hit different in retrospect. I think I could talk about these last couple of episodes for literal hours because they get so many things right. But out of fear of rambling on, I'll just say that even for someone familiar with the books, in terms of sheer excitement, I don't think any single episode has done it so well as we see with the season 6 finale. That is, of course, until the finale of the finale, though hold that thought for now. And with that, in both versions, they head out for Hilltop. Though here too, the show made quite a few changes which significantly alter the whole vibe of it. In the show, we'd of course meet Simon, who very ominously greets Rick and essentially lets them know that they're Number 1, Simon, played by Stephen Ogg, is exclusive to the show and is 100% the best addition to the Negan Saga. And like no joke, I wouldn't even be surprised if the writers just told him, hey, just play Trevor from GTA again and you'll be good. Because come on, you can't tell me Simon isn't just straight up Trevor in like 70% of situations. But yeah, an absolutely amazing character who I would have loved to see more of. And number 2, in the books, there are no run-ins like this. I do admit, in terms of cooking up the reveal, the TV show handled it perfectly, and the whole turning a corner to see more and more of the Saviors was a nice addition. But when it comes to the book, like most of the initial Negan Saga, it more so comes as a complete shock. Because as Rick is staying watch, he is suddenly yoinked off of the RV and is dragged right into the rest of the Saviors. So just like that, a regular stop to camp out for the night becomes the introduction of Negan. And another thing for the adaptation is that this isn't the only storyline taking place, because we also get to see what Morgan and Carol are up to, notably them running into the Kingdom's people. This is pushed earlier in the adaptation, as in the book, the Kingdom would only be introduced after the initial Negan stuff happens. But as of now, Morgan and Carol are already headed to the Kingdom. In the show, on the other hand, Simon's cat and mouse game continues right up until sunset. Though when Rick decides that they'll head out on foot since it's much easier to track them with the RV, we get to what I still think is among the greatest scenes in the show. I think I've made it pretty clear that I absolutely love nighttime shoots, but combined with the absolute horror that is the whistling starting all around them is seriously a 10 out of 10. And in that sense, I think the TV version remixed this moment absolutely masterfully. Because while the surprise factor may have been gone initially, here it was back in full force. And with that, the group is lined up as the man of the hour himself makes his debut. I think every single Walking Dead viewer, for better or worse, has this scene burned into their memory, so we won't go through the entire thing again, but there are still plenty of things I want to mention. Number 1, as we talked about with Jesus, here too we see characters being taken aback by Rick being the leader, where Negan outright says, "You're missing a hand. These people must worship you." And while this does apply to both versions to some extent, I do think that because of Rick's outward appearance, that is a bit more pronounced in the book. Number 2, Jeffrey Dean Morgan. Man, this guy's range is exactly what we needed from Negan. The way he can slide from that sadistic smile to stone cold serious right back to smiling is precisely how I pictured Negan in the books. And in my opinion, this is absolutely perfect casting. Number 3, the entire eeny meeny miny mo sequence. In this case, obviously all praise goes only to Kirkman because once again, the man is a mad genius. The whole sequence tells you so many different things about Negan. First off, he deliberately explains why he doesn't want to pick certain people, clearly showing you that he isn't just some nutso. He's obviously evil, but he's not totally mad. But then, he turns right around and decides his victim through a game, leaving you with the question of, what is going on in this guy's head? In terms of villains, obviously Kirkman has proven that his writing is already on another level, but Negan still reigns on top because of how simple yet complex he is. Number 4, Negan's very colorful language. Call me childish, but the fact that due to US TV's bizarro guidelines the show couldn't even drop F-bombs seriously detracted from his character. The uncensored version of the sequence had 23 F-bombs. Like seriously, the scene is available here on YouTube. Please watch it and see the difference. But because it obviously didn't make sense to literally film 2 versions of each and every scene where Negan is in, this is the only one we got uncensored. But seriously, it immediately carries a completely different tone in my opinion, which would become even more pronounced as time went on. I will never understand people complaining about realism and everything else of that nature in the show because, in my mind, it has never really attempted to be realistic. It's always been extremely comic booky. I mean, come on. Rick is the most stereotypical comic book sheriff of all time at the start of the series. I think that makes it pretty clear. But anyway, I think removing Negan's colorful language also removed a lot of that comic booky flair and changed the way we perceive Negan. It's difficult to put into words, but I guess the best way to describe it is the uncanny valley. Without his very colorful and over-the-top language, he appeared to be a lot more formal and serious, while still being extremely comic booky, which might have been a reason why people had a negative reaction right off the bat. And if you look at Negan's character in the present story, it's almost like the writers forgot about his comedic side, because yeah, I mean the story is dark, right? But still, Negan is a messed up dude, he'd laugh about everything. But in the show, he is now 100% serious. And obviously, this is not a problem for the comic book, nothing is censored. Number 5, it is the shock value. You will have no doubt noticed that I deliberately avoided talking about the cliffhanger up until now. Well, buckle up, because here we go. The thing with the comic, which I've already mentioned many times, is that all of these events are a complete shock. The entire Negan introduction happens within half an issue. He shows up, delivers his speech, picks his victim, bonks them, and leaves. All within half of an issue. Obviously everyone was expecting something big for issue 100. But if you read this when it originally came out, the only words that can describe what you saw was complete and utter shock. In the show, on the other hand, sure there was some of that, but no matter how much you try to replicate it, if you leave the audience to sit on it for literally 6 months, it will not have the same meaning. To keep things simple here, I'll propose a potential rewrite for this episode without changing any of the events we see here when we talk about the Season 7 premiere, so sorry, but I'm pulling a cliffhanger myself here. But hey, it'll remind you of how infuriating the wait actually was. Number 6 is the meta factor. The fact that we got the cliffhanger absolutely ruined all promotional material. Because they obviously wanted to keep absolutely all hints to a minimum about who survived the lineup, we got what is, in my opinion, hands down the most forgettable and downright terrible trailer the series has ever had. Literally half of it are scenes from previous episodes and Negan just doing the eeny meeny miny thing. I'm not kidding. Go back and watch it. We'll talk about the trailer more next time because I still think there are high points of it, but in the grand scheme of things, I do think that it ruined a lot of potential hype about the upcoming Negan story simply because you couldn't even show any of it. If I'm being honest, I think the best promo material for the Negan Saga that came out during this time wasn't even from the show. Rather, it's this fan-made poster just teasing Rick standing off against Negan. And in the same vein, number 7, spoilers. I'm sorry, but if you expected to keep something like this under wraps for 6 months, then I really don't know what to tell you. To be fair, they did manage to do a much better job than usual, and as far as I know, a vast majority of the audience was unaware of the spoilers, but obviously once filming began, the victims still leaked. Again, I think there was a much better way of handling these same exact events that still would have given a satisfying ending to the season while still leaving people buzzing throughout the summer, but I digress. Though returning to the story for a bit, number 8, Carl. Once again, the show tried to replicate some of the book, but it felt nothing alike in my opinion. In the book, Negan outright calls him a future serial killer and says that his story looks way too interesting to be cut short, which considering what Carl's done is basically true. In the show though, yeah, he tells him to cry a little or whatever, but it's nowhere near as impactful. And lastly, number 9, Glenn's outburst. In the book, once they were lined up, none of them really tried anything anymore. Clearly, they were in way over their heads. But in the show, once Negan says that he'll just put Maggie out of her misery, Glenn jumps up prompting Negan to tell them if anyone tries anything again, he'll shut it down. This will be important for season 7, so keep that in mind for now. And with all that said, in my opinion, you have what might just be one of the greatest villain introductions in all of media. The sheer horror of this whole thing is something else entirely. Which is saying a lot, considering we've already had literal cannibals in the series. And while in many ways, I think the show absolutely nailed Negan's introduction, even surpassing the book with the whole whistling sequence, all in all, I don't think you'll be surprised when I say that I still prefer the book's version for a variety of reasons. The lack of some greedy cliffhanger and the uncensored language being among the most prominent ones. But to quickly summarize the main differences, the Negan lineup is different in the show and the comic version, but the only one that would ultimately matter is Abraham, who was killed by Dwight in the book before they even met Negan. In the show, Abe's death was remixed for Denise instead. Also, Carol and Morgan are already being taken to the kingdom, which happens later in the book. And perhaps most importantly, in the show, as of now, Rick's group has killed 56 saviors. While in the book, it is 10 tops. And with that, next time, because of the cliffhanger, we'll be delving into the actual Negan reveal and talking about all things Negan Saga. From massive drops in viewers to new communities and everything in between. And that's the video, and that is also Season 6 finally wrapped up. But now we'll be entering the Wild West of The Walking Dead, so I hope you're ready and I hope you're excited. Though with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my rambling, so seriously, thank you, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye!